Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first TPM Meetup Virtual 2021. We're going to start shortly in few minutes, 3-4 minutes. In the meantime, please use the chat in the Zoom to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you joining from? Which company? Are you in TPM role or aspiring TPM? And we'll take 3-4 minutes and let other folks to join the event, and we'll officially kick it off. Welcome on board. I see people getting introductions in the chat. Please keep them coming. We're starting in short 2 minutes. Welcome for the new attendees. We are about 40 people right now. Looking for more. We have more than 140 registered, so let's give them some time to onboard. All right, so with that, I want to officially kick things off and invite to our virtual stage the host of the first virtual TPM meetup of 2021, Harman from Airbnb. Welcome, Harman.
Thank you, Janet. I'm so delighted to welcome everybody to today's event. I'm your host for the panel discussion. Topic we have today is how do we grow? It's one thing that always is close to all of us is how do we get to a career growth? So as Janet said, my name is Harman Batra and I work at Airbnb as a TPM leader. Before I talk more about the panel, I wanted to introduce the behind the scene collaborators. You heard from Janet, who's the TPM at Robinhood. He's in charge of today's production, controlling the webinar and the breakout rooms. We have Spencer from Slack, who helped us put together these wonderful questions for the panel that I'll share in the conversation. Then we had Amruta, Jen Russell, and Matty joining us. They have played a significant role getting us to this point. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping things that I just wanted to reiterate. We are in a webinar mode for the panel discussion, and we will need to all join back using the second link that you would have received as part of the email or in the Slack channel. We'll remind that towards the end of the panel. This would be used for the breakout rooms. Feel free to use the chat in the Zoom to converse more and Q&A for the post follow-up questions for the panelists. You can also chat on the Slack workspace. We have the Meetup event channel. If you feel that is useful for interaction to chat more with folks, you can use that too. We are supposed to have a good coverage today. Like as Zara said, we have 140 plus folks that have RSVP. So we do expect more than 100 plus folks would be here. Most folks are TPM in their current roles, but some are aspiring TPMs too. So our Slack workspace is a safe place for us to interact. So you can use that to use that further to make meaningful connections. In your Zoom link email, you will find the link to the Slack space. So if you haven't joined so far, do connect with us over there. To help with interactions, we have also enabled the Donut app in the Slack via the TPM Donut Slack channel that matches you with folks interested in conversations and allow you to share and learn from others. Do join the TPM Donut channel if you're interested in forming more meaningful conversations. We would also like to bring more topics and do such sessions at least once a quarter. So if anyone is interested in doing the next one in Q2, connect with me on Slack and I will help you get started as the next event organizer. A team of 3 to 5 folks would be enough for this. Okay, then let me, with that, I would like to invite our panelists to the virtual stage. So we will ask pre-prepared questions to our panelists, but if you have any follow-up questions related to the topic or what they are sharing with us, add to the Q&A section. If I will try to squeeze some of these along the way or bring it up towards the end if we have time. So let's start with a brief intro on our panelists via the first question. And the first question that I have is, can you share a little about your work history, your journey as a TPM, and how you arrived in your current role? Over to you, Ibrahim, to get started.
Hey, folks. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Alrighty. So I apologize. I'm suffering from severe allergies, hence all the sniffling. But a little bit about my history. So I studied computer science in school. I thought I wanted to be an engineer forever. After about 1.5 jobs as an engineer, I realized it's not what I wanted to do. I didn't really know what to do with my career at that point. And so I did what a lot of my friends were doing. I went into consulting. And so I did that for a number of years. It was a very, I'd call it like mercenary existence where I solved problems, but it was really for people who were willing to pay the billable hours. And so it was unfulfilling in a way. And so after that, I basically decided to look for something that would give me more meaning in terms of delivery. And that's when I actually transitioned to Amazon as a TPM. And so that was my first foray into the role. And from there, I actually transitioned to Twitter, where I helped build out the TPM function. And then after that, I went to Box and did enterprise software. And most recently, I joined Amplitude, where I'm leading the core product. So that's a little bit about my journey. So I've played a TPM role at multiple stops and have played other roles like consultant, product, and engineer as well.
You're muted, Harman.
Oh, sorry. I said thanks, Ibrahim, for the intro. Let's move to Yomi.
Hi, folks. I'm Yomi. My journey, I started off, I did electrical electronic engineering undergrad, realized that there was more IT jobs and people got paid more to do kind of IT and technology things. So I then did a master's in telecommunications and computing. Unix sysadmin, IT manager at ATI. And then I transitioned to be a TPM at Google, leveraging all kind of my prior expertise. Was at Google for like 11 years, TPMing across 5 different teams. Company grown a lot, so I got to experience lots of different TPM opportunities at Google. And then ultimately migrated to working in the city. Hadn't worked in the city of San Francisco ever, so it was good to kind of get on BART for those who enjoy BART. I went to work in San Francisco at Dropbox. And there I we kind of took on a large service-oriented architecture program, also ran the PMO for the CTO's office for engineering for about a year, and then ultimately ended up running the NPI program for the delivery of Dropbox's hardware. And so, yeah, a mix of kind of technical work and then program management work, non-certified.
Thank you, Yomi, for that. Let's move on to Rebecca.
Hello, and thanks for having me. Happy to be here. Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca. Working backward, my current position is a chief of staff to the chief product officer, Tamar Yoshua, at Slack. I've been in that role for about a year. Before that, I was a TPM at Slack for about 4.5 years, where I worked on all kinds of things. I worked on client infra, I worked on client engineering, I worked on infra engineering, and I also worked with product teams. Before that, I was a project manager for about 2 years working on software. And before that, I was a business program manager at Rackspace. And that's sort of how I got into tech. I joined Rackspace in a non-technical role. And one of the programs I had in the early days was running the engineering internship program. And through that, I got to know a lot of the engineering leads. And they decided to take a chance on me. They thought I had some potential. And they said, hey, why don't you come work for us and do some project management on the software side? And I was like, I don't know anything about software. They're like, it's okay, we'll teach you. And so that was the beginning. I never imagined that I would have a career in software, but turns out I liked it a lot. So here I am. And before that, I was a classroom teacher. I taught high school in California for 4 years. I taught elementary school in New York City for 1 year. And so my background is, I guess, non-traditional, or like I think a lot of folks here didn't start out thinking that I would be a TPM or a chief of staff. But that's just how life worked out.
That's amazing to hear, Rebecca. Let's move to our last panelist, Clemens.
Cool. Thanks. Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me. I got into technical program management stumbling into an internship at Google. I was doing my master's in Berlin and was just applying at all kinds of companies in the Bay Area for product management and technical program management without really knowing what it is. And it turns out the interview process at Google worked out fairly easily, to the extent that all of a sudden I was a TPM in platforms, which at that point in time was data center automation, new hardware within Google's data centers. And I really liked what I was doing. I don't really think I knew exactly what I was doing, but I really liked being a technical program manager, working in a pretty technical engineering-driven field. And so I stuck around. I got a return offer to come back after my master's. I moved here full time. And I guess 13, 14 years later, I'm still a TPM at heart. I traversed the tech stack at Google fairly heavily, moving from hardware, firmware up to the application layer. I worked on Gmail for a pretty long time, was part of a team that was called Inbox, which doesn't exist anymore today, but I had a fun time building it with a bunch of people at Google. And then switched to Uber, also similar to what Yomi said. I wanted to work in the city finally, because I always lived in the city. And I wanted to work in an office that I don't have to sit on a shuttle for an hour and a half. So I started at Uber as one of the first fewish TPMs, helped build the TPM function at Uber, and then ultimately led the product-focused side of the TPM team. And then ultimately, just 2 months ago, I switched to Robinhood to take on the TPM function there, as well as expand my scope a little bit towards engineering enablement and engineering operations. I can get into what that exactly means currently a bit later on, but that's the high-level take on myself.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for the introduction. As you can see, all of our panelists today bring different perspectives toward career growth. They have taken different paths and have grown either as a TPM or grown out into product and engineering. This is what career growth is about. It is specific to an individual based on what your ambitions are, what opportunities get presented to you. Sometimes it's luck driven, but it's also a result of a lot of hard work that you put together in your current role and the relationships you build with key leaders along the way. So next question for our panelists, here is, and let's start this time with Yomi. Can you take us through a day in life of your current role? What are the projects you work on, and who do you work with, and what is exciting and what is challenging? Yomi, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Thanks for the question, Harman. Basically, my most recent project kind of was what I call the new product introduction MPI team, which was delivering the 3 classes of hardware for Dropbox's infrastructure: compute, storage, and database machines. I had a kind of OXM model. OXM model meaning somebody built the machines for us. We took a kind of stock machine, added some pieces on top of it, and took that through a qualification cycle that was probably about 1.25 years to about 2 years, depending on kind of what the machine class was. Across effectively 5 cross-functional teams: hardware engineering, supply chain, storage team, database team, capacity planning, and production systems. What was exciting about it is kind of managing key stakeholders with different goals. So my 2 main key stakeholders were supply chain team and the hardware engineering team. One team, hardware engineering, through this qualification cycle, their main goal was to maintain good quality and reliability of whatever they delivered into the data center, which made perfect sense. And supply chain team, by contrast, kind of was their main focus was kind of vendor relationships. You know, Dropbox is as large as Dropbox is relatively small in the scale of technology companies, and so having good suppliers that would give you allocation compared to the Googles and Facebooks and Microsofts was important. And so that team really focused on trying to make sure that they kept the vendors on side. They managed cost and got stuff delivered on time. And these 2 different kind of objectives for these teams caused a lot of clashes a lot of time. And so what was exciting about it was my ability as program manager to kind of establish common, or try to establish common program goals and iron out the issues that resulted from these 2 different kind of objectives. I'll talk more about that later.
Good. Thank you, Yomi. Over to you, Clemens.
Sure. It really depends what hat I'm wearing that day. I have currently, as I mentioned, I have 3 hats. I interchange. My TPM hat is currently focused on different scalability programs, as Robinhood is scaling a lot in all different dimensions, horizontal and vertical from an engineering architecture perspective. So there's a lot of TPMs on the team who are driving hands-on scalability aspects. I'm focused on one of the work streams as part of that, and then specifically a broader framework of how do we scale these type of programs across engineering as we scale engineering, as we're currently hiring a lot of engineers. That's my TPM hat. I also work heavily currently on planning and then headcount prioritization and allocation. That's sort of my engineering operations hat. And then in my spare time, I also work on more enablement functions around how do we onboard engineers, how do we onboard TPMs to the company, as well as what culture across engineering do we want to drive while we're remote, as well as when we get back into the office as we grow the engineering team. Happy to dive into more of these individual areas later on, but that's the high level. Super diverse, a lot of engineering leadership, but also the people team, the finance team, product, BizOps, the whole gamut really of cross-functional stakeholders.
So what is challenging over there for you?
Prioritization, because we're trying to do so much at once and really ruthlessly figuring out what do I get to today versus what can I push to next week. I would say that's the biggest challenge, but also the biggest opportunity, because exactly is what are the few things we really want to tackle versus are we spread too thin on just 100 things? I think that's a big piece. Excitement, just because I think that was also in the question. I'm excited about all of it, actually. It's a lot of fun. It's the people, the wide range of topics. That's even in a nutshell what the TPM program and TPM role is for me, because it's so diverse.
Yeah, great insight. I think that's how we see TPM roles to be so collaborative across the board, that it's so useful to hear your thoughts on that. Over to you, Rebecca.
Awesome, thanks. Let's see, a day in the life. In my current role as Chief of Staff, I work on all kinds of things. I work on operations and running the business. That might be things like recruiting, budget, headcount planning. I spend a considerable amount of my time on both internal and external comms. So both written and sort of video presentations that go out internally, as well as PR and prep for external events. I work on programming for the product org itself. I run meetings, I work on M&A, and I support in addition to supporting my boss, our chief product officer, I also support the senior leaders in our product org in various ways. And I still get to work on some projects, which is fun. For example, one of the projects I'm working on right now is it's led by TPMs at Slack, and I have sort of more of an advisory role. If it's okay, I'll tell you a little bit about it. We're running a pilot. This is just something we're testing out. We're not committed to running it over the long term, but we are trying out a new way of releasing features. And it's only available for some select customers. What we're trying to solve for is visibility and predictability for some of our more mature customers who have some challenges with change management and with the way that we ship features. So I think to help explain that better, I'll explain a little bit about our business model at Slack. We have a pretty unique one. We have a consumer-like self-service business where consumers or small teams come to our website, they come to slack.com, they sign up. And it's very organic, but we also have, an enterprise sales motion, and we sell our service to lots of large enterprises. I'm not going to name any of them, but you could probably look on our website and see and figure it out. But those more mature enterprises, they really do expect a more fixed cadence of release. But we're kind of in this we're kind of a hybrid business, and so we have to ship quickly and we have to maintain our quality to kind of keep that consumer the quality that people come to expect with a consumer app. And so what we're doing with this program is we're going to be running release trains that have a fixed cadence for our more mature accounts, while we continue to ship sort of when ready and sort of more of a continuous delivery motion for everyone else. I call it hybrid release. So that's something I'm working on right now that's kind of exciting, and it's actually led by TPMs at Slack. I think I answered the question of a day in the life and what is exciting. I will share something challenging. I think as a chief of staff, you don't always have control over your own calendar and your own workflow. Things come up, you have to deal with them, and you have to make time for things, even when it wasn't your plan. And so, you may have to react with comms or form a plan pretty quickly. And at first, this can be jarring. I think when I moved from the TPM role into the chief of staff role, I was like, oh my God, I don't even control my life anymore. What's going on? But you do get used to it. And then you do get better at it. And then it kind of becomes exciting, because it forces you to kind of preload a lot of your work and stay ahead of the ball, because you may not have, you may think, oh, I'll spend 2 hours this afternoon working on XYZ, but that time may disappear and you may have little control over it. So that's something that can be challenging in the role.
Great, Rebecca. That's good to know. Moving to Ibrahim.
Yes. So I think the question was, tell us about your day-to-day, what's exciting, what's challenging.
Yes.
So day-to-day, so just to reiterate for anybody who joined late, I'm on the product leadership team at Amplitude. I would say there's a variety of hats I wear. I think one hat is I'm the leader of the core product team. So just the day-to-day helping PMs on what they're working on, whether it's spec writing or there's a release coming up or how to message something or should it be monetized, those kinds of like day-to-day things with the product team. Then if you bubble up a level, I'm on what you'd call sort of the product engineering design leadership team. And so there's a lot of like across pillar type things like how are we doing planning and how are we doing releases and are we actually moving the metrics we said we wanted to move? So those kinds of things take up a lot of my time. And then lastly, I guess I'm on the executive team of the company. And so that's like another version of like, where are we in the market and how are we doing versus competition? And there's a different set of metrics that executives look at. And so I just usually juggle those three hats throughout the day. In terms of what's exciting, we have a very lean product team and the goal is to just double it this year. So I'm hiring a lot. So that is super exciting. By the way, I'm looking at the chat and it says Spencer is monitoring all questions. That freaked me out because Spencer is my CEO. I don't think it's the same Spencer. No, so hiring is very exciting. And that's where a lot of my energy is going in right now. What's challenging is I think whenever you meet other folks at the company or externally and you tell them you work on the product, they expect you to be like an expert on the product and answer every and all questions. And so I have this anxiety. I've only been there 2 months where I'm like, I'm not an expert. And in one way, I'm like, I'm getting 1% better every day. But in another way, I'm like, I'm not at the level I need to be at. So that is challenging, is like, how do you actually carve out time hands-on with the product to learn it while you're actually planning how to evolve it? And so I haven't mastered that trade-off yet.
Perfect. Thank you, Ryan. So yeah, as you heard, every individual has a different journey. They carve out their paths based on the opportunities that they are presented with. So we also have a set of questions that we want to focus on that are specific to the panelists. So let's understand the growing out of the TPM track first with product and engineering related questions. So Rebecca, this one is for you. How is your TPM experience? Like, how did your TPM experience prepare you to be chief of staff? Like, how is it different from the TPM work that you used to do?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of transferable skills. I don't know that I would say, yeah, I think it's pretty wide ranging. It's hard to pinpoint and be like, oh, well, this aspect of TPMing like really prepared me for my role as a chief of staff. I think though that there are some parallels in sort of the way the job gets done. I think that as a TPM, you need to lead through influence. You don't always have direct authority over the folks you're working with. You sometimes are not a decision maker. And so those sort of soft skills transfer very well, I think. I would say that for my role in particular, I think it's a combination of having been at the company long enough to know a lot of people and having had a track record of getting stuff done. So I think that as a TPM, you do get to work, especially if you move across different product and engineering groups, you get to know a lot of people, you get to work with a lot of leaders, you form relationships with engineering, with product, with, with marketing and others. And so you start to build this kind of big network at the company of people who will champion and endorse you. And so I don't know that there's any hard skills necessarily that I would say have really prepared me for this role, except to say that, building those relationships, building the trust and having establishing a track record of someone that can get things done is probably all you need to transfer into a role of chief of staff. The only other thing I would say is like kind of a parallel here is, you have to treat people fairly. You have to be pretty humble. You have to, like, the people around you have to want to see you succeed. And you have to have people rooting for you, I think, in the chief of staff role. I'm a lot more junior than the people I work with and support directly. And so you have to have a low ego and you have to be able to take feedback and direction, pretty seamlessly. And I think that TPMing did prepare me for that, because often like you're working with principal engineers and you're trying to like guide their work, right? But they're just like way, way, way more senior and knowledgeable than you. And I think being a chief of staff is kind of like that too. So yeah, being humble, leading through influence, having low ego, those things all help.
Amazing, Rebecca. I think that you nailed it down. As a TPM, we end up in those scenarios so many times where we are working with directors, leaders, to try and execute on initiatives or their most important priorities. And these are the skills that definitely are valuable to anyone in these kind of situations. Next one for Ibrahim though. What's the most important skill to have in an executive role? Like, did you have to learn any new skills to get there or after you got there?
Yeah, I would say one skill that comes to mind, it's not something net new. I think it was something I had in my tool bag, but I was surprised at the degree to which I had to utilize it, is I'd call it like operating on a longer time horizon. I think the reality is when you're in an individual role, a lot of times you can do something that pays off in a day, a week, a month. I think in an executive role, most of the things you're doing, nobody's going to realize whether they were right or wrong for months or quarters and sometimes years, which is kind of ironic and hilarious because executives get elevated all the time for short-term things they didn't do, and they get in trouble for things long-term that they also didn't do. And so it's kind of a lose-lose situation. But that was the biggest thing for me was it's almost like you're playing chess by mail, and like you make one move, you put it in an envelope, and then 3 quarters later, you'll find out if you did the right thing or not. And nobody's going to remember that it was your decision that led to that. So I think you have to be very patient and long-term planning thinking. And you can't get too hung up on sort of getting credit or avoiding blame, because it's just, it's hard to tie it back. So I think that's one skill where I generally like to plan things out. And so it paid off in that regard. I would say there's definitely other skills that I had to learn before I got into the role or like during the role. One of them I'd say, and this is where I think having been a TPM is very valuable, you have to connect the cross-functional dots to business outcomes. So I think a lot of folks on the product side get obsessed with what did you ship or did you move the metric? But the metric is just a proxy. There's only a couple of things a company cares about: revenue, retention, churn. And so you have to get very good at explaining how A leads to B, leads to C, leads to Z. And so you have to be able to map product to eng, to marketing, to sales, to business outcomes. And so I think that's something that I've definitely learned and gotten better at. 2 is, I think, some or a lot of you may have hired, but I learned there's a huge difference between hiring individuals and then hiring managers to hire individuals, because it creates this level of abstraction. And at some point, you're just the leader of the org, and people know the managers more than you, and your influence is indirect and through the managers. And so really learning to work like that spider web of the hierarchy versus one-on-one going to every individual was definitely a skill I evolved. And then the last is I'm terrified of public speaking, but in an executive role, there's no dodging that bullet. And so whether it's all hands or like the beginning of a planning cycle, or externally or at a conference or in front of an analyst, you get reps and reps and reps. And so although I still have a little bit of anxiety right before, I think just doing it a lot has helped.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Zainab just pinged me through saying that I need to have excitement in my voice. So I'll probably learn from what you said in terms of bringing excitement with more and more in public speaking. Good. Let's shift our focus towards hearing from folks that are marching along the TPM track. Yomi, this one is for you. What does excellence look like at the IC TPM level? What do you think are the core skills for a TPM? Oh, you're on mute.
Yes, first thing, learn how to unmute soon. So I'll kind of start off by defining what your goal is. And typically it's to kind of move a team of people, a singular team, cross-functional team, doesn't matter which, or to develop repeatable program results, right? And or to improve the operating cadence of the team if you're kind of running the team from a sprint operating cadence kind of agile perspective. Yeah. How do you do this? How do you do this as a TPM and develop excellence? You're in some respects, I think, as we all know, you're a conductor, but you have to influence and you have no authority, as kind of Rebecca and Ibrahim have said. Yeah. And ultimately, in my experience, kind of the way to do it is you have to do what everybody else is not doing. You have to kind of own the overall plan. A lot of times when you're working cross-functionally, the reason they bring in TPMs is no particular one EM or one team wants to drive across the board. And so you come in and you own the overall plan, or you own kind of operating the sprintly cadence because the engineering manager doesn't want to do it. And ultimately you become the glue to the pieces of the team or the various teams, right? Some specifics. I think there's 3 areas from a skill perspective that I try and home in on. Simplification, communication, and risk management. From a simplification perspective, of the program management 3 constraints of quality / results, time, cost, or budget. You want to pick one of those that you use to drive the team forward. It's hard to, if you don't simplify things and you try and drive across all, it's hard to create momentum and create focus. And so typically you pick 1 or 2 of those that you use to drive forward. In my experience, typically it's quality of results and or time that you use. We sacrifice budget a lot. Hopefully the finance people aren't here. And you focus the team on simplified goals. Even though there's a lot of complexity behind you kind of have to try and deliver simplicity. You publish and communicate a lot, right? Communication is the key for program managers. Why you are making sure that everybody's informed as much as possible. Everybody has access to the same information. Information's exposed so that decision making is improved. And same things when you're running sprints, right? You kind of publish information on a regular basis. You're looking at kind of execution dashboards, giving the team feedback so that they know where they are and when they need to run harder, run slower, and how you help the engineering manager prioritize. And so communication and publishing information is key. And then lastly, you manage risk, right? You have to identify said risk, keep your eyes, ears, and in the modern world, all the various IM channels, keep your eyes open and know what's happening where. Kind of a good sign is people will bring you problems, right? When there's problems to be solved, they'll come to you and flag them, whether to kind of derail or whether to just let you know, but that's a good sign that you're kind of being an effective TPM. And then ultimately, for instance, politics, you kind of be a no drama Obama, right? Ultimately, your job is not to add to the chaos. Your job is to kind of help solve the chaos and kind of try to keep things calm and don't add fuel to the fire. And you use all the tools as a TPM, kind of RACI ownership, issue logs, slippage logs, agile execution dashboards to try and keep things calm and keep the team focused. And that way you as I said at the beginning, you fill in the gaps and help the teams execute and deliver.
Thanks, Yomi. That was a great selection of the TPM skills that you put out there. Clemens, for you now, would love to hear about your transition from an IC role to a manager role when you did that, and why did you make that change, and how is it different than from being an IC?
Sure. Given I was an intern originally for TPM, I was fairly keen actually on having a TPM be part of the engineering team I was supporting as quickly as possible. And Google allowed that fairly early. I think I was 3 years into my tenure at Google, meaning 3 years out of my master's degree as well. And so I became an intern host, and the intern converted and I became her manager. And I didn't even think much about it, which I think is an issue, because being a manager should be a very deliberate change in your role. But at that time, and maybe part of it was the dynamics and sort of the nature of being a manager at Google at that point in time, you don't necessarily think that much about it. So even my next role within Google, where I managed a team of 5-6 TPMs and a few program managers, I didn't even think much about it either. I just sort of maneuvered. For the first time, really, I started reflecting on what it means to be a manager and seeing it as really a different role with different success criteria, with different skill sets, was at Uber when I hired quite a few people. And very similar to what Ibrahim mentioned, I started hiring managers who then hired people. And that really just showed me that it needs to be a very deliberate move. It cannot be the means to climbing a career ladder, I think. It needs to be thoughtful of what am I trying to get out of this role? And I would say for a lot of people, the IC path, and if the company that you're at provides a strong IC leadership path, might actually be the better option. But it's unfortunate. I would love to discuss that a little bit. In many companies, there's this feeling that you need to become a manager to climb to the higher parts of the hierarchy and get promoted. And I would love to see that change, because ultimately, and maybe that's again sort of being nurtured by Google early on, ICs and tech leads, and for me, IC TPMs really drive tons of impact, and they should reach the highest levels of staff, senior staff, principal, whatever nomenclature you want to use. For me personally, I love being a manager once I really figured out that it's a different job function and what comes with it. And I dug into it. I really enjoyed the people side of it. That said, they're not always pretty. It's a hard job. Sometimes I think there's a bit of a myth on, oh, I just want to become a manager and then it's going to be easier for me to get promoted and to hire a big team. It's not necessarily. There's clearly, Harman, you mentioned the aspect of luck. There's clearly, you need to be at the right org at the right time. You need to have headcount so you can grow the team. You need to, there's always a bit of luck with hiring as well. So long story short, being deliberate, seeing it as a separate job function with different expectations will provide clarity, I think, to yourself, and then how you see yourself growing on that job path. That's been eye-opening for me, and that's what I try to tell the people I manage who are sort of at this verge of senior to staff TPMs who are thinking about, should I become a manager? Should I try to go down the IC path? Making it a deliberate choice where possible, I think, is really important.
Perfect. That was a great answer, Clemens. Let's get back to Yomi on this one. Like, how important is a technical background to one's progression in the TPM ranks? How do you suggest TPMs get that experience?
Thanks for that question, Harman. So I'd say this. I'd kind of classify it as small t versus big T, small. And I'd say having good technical knowledge is important to maximize your career potential across the tech industry. And what I mean by that is your ability to go from tech company to tech company, right? The less T you have, the more likely you are to either go down the program management route or more what we call operational program management as opposed to technical program management. So I'd say it's important to have a strong T. And ultimately, as I said, there's kind of more places in the tech industry that would ask for a T than not. And if you have it, it's useful. If you don't have it, then it's harder to get the job. By T, big T, I'd kind of say ultimately it becomes having high level system knowledge, as we acknowledge as program managers. I remember employee number 8 at Google would say to me, Yomi, I know you're trained as an electrical engineer, but we didn't hire you here as that. So I'm going to rely on the electrical engineers for electrical engineering advice, and you can do kind of the program management stuff. And so you always have to kind of remember that you're not there as a technical expert, And you're there to kind of manage without influence. So kind of just having broad system understanding and relying on your technical experts, I'd say, is kind of the way to go from a big T perspective. Yeah. You know, if you to gain that experience, if either you had it coming in, kind of having hands-on experience before you kind of transition to be a TPM, that's good, somewhere in the 2 to 10 year range. As much as possible, if you can keep your hands dirty, go on-call rotations and stuff like that with your engineers, that's useful. Help them check in code, help them fixing code, help them do debugs without being responsible. That's useful. Kind of to talk specifically about maybe specific companies, again, at my time at Google, what would typically happen is at promo time, if your T was considered to be small t as opposed to big T, you'd be offered an off-ramp onto the program management ladder as opposed to carrying on the technical program management ladder. And that got formalized as a kind of way of helping people navigate their careers. And big T was typically assessed as being a couple of levels down, doing engineering work a couple of levels down from your technical program management level. And so that became a relatively easy thing for folks to keep an eye on. And then the more senior you became, it was more about system understanding as you worked a lot cross-functionally. So you had to be aware of system level things and not deep dive. By contrast, at Dropbox, Dropbox kind of had a blend of small T's and big T's, and they never really formalized bifurcating those career ladders for whatever reason. It was also made more difficult there because the pecking order of management, as it were, was EMs first, PMs next, TPMs last. And so they relied heavily on the EMs to drive technical decisions, and you know, the TPMs got relegated to the back or stuff like that. Lastly, I'd say, you know, if you look industry-wise, as I says, strong T companies, Amazon, I've heard, I don't know because I haven't worked at all these places, but Amazon, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, they typically want strong Ts. And so that's why, again, I'd say it's important. And as you go through your career, just try to make sure that you understand system and dive deep where you need to. Obviously, you can't understand everything. The goal is not that you do, but it's that you have awareness and can work with the engineers cross-functionally as you do. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Yomi. Those were some good insights. Clemens, back to you. At Robinhood, you've unified a few different teams under technical programs. What advice do you have for managing and growing diverse team with different skills?
Know what you're getting yourself into, maybe. No, it's high level. I would say build identities across these different functions, build brands across the functions. One of the things I regret at Uber is, for example, we were mixing program management and technical program management too much in teams, that they were blending in, very similar to what Yomi mentioned about the big T versus small t. I do think it's very important to have clear expectations set for each of the functions, and also then offer clear paths for the functions. If you want to grow from a small t to a big T, from a small p to a big P, and would love to dive more into the program management angles, I think we need to offer these paths. And we didn't do that, or I didn't do that enough at Uber. So one of the lessons there is the brand and identity building aspect. And I think that's the core part. Actually, I would leave it at that and see if there are follow-up questions from the group.
Perfect. Then I think so. Let's move to the non-TPM track and hear from Ibrahim and Rebecca next. So next one is for you, Ibrahim. How did you know you were ready to be an exec? What was that goal, and how did it? Was that a goal, or did it evolve organically?
So I think first I just challenge the assumption that, you're ready or not ready. I think I don't like the word exec. It makes me feel like the people I make fun of. And so the first thing I'd say is in a leadership role, you're managing an organization, and an organization is like an organism, and it's constantly evolving. And so you're never ready. People come in, people come out, their moods change, their focus change, their rituals change, their communication channels change. And so you're never really stable. You're always sort of trying to stay one step ahead of where the org is going. So I don't say I'm ever ready or not ready. The second thing is, I think getting into management and leadership and executive leadership was a very organic journey for me. I'm a very metrics driven person. And I would say I've always had a metric in my head that I'm striving for. So when I first started my career, it was a very simple metric. It was a KPI. It was income exceeds expenses. That was it. And if income exceeded expenses, I was good to go. Okay, sorry, give me 1 second. I have a visitor.
Classic work from home.
No, so I was saying income exceeds expenses. Then, at some point I was like, that's not a good enough metric. I was like, the number of things that I feel good about putting out in the world is what I would want to be my metric. So then I actually started working as a program manager on products that I was excited about. And from then on, I actually chose roles based on would I actually want to work on this. I worked on the Kindle at Amazon. I worked on Twitter as a service, and I was very proud of those things. I was like, I'm putting good out into the world. So that was a metric for a while. Somewhere in there, I transitioned to managing people. And I think the first time I got feedback as a manager, like really positive feedback, where somebody said, you're the best manager I've ever had. And I was like, that's a great feeling. And at some point I made that my metric, the number of people who would say I was the best manager they had ever had. And so, I mean, not to brag, I'd say it's in the double digits now. And so that was my metric for a while. And more recently, I realized something, which is I've managed so many people at so many different places that I'm able to connect those people now and do interesting things. So I had a former direct report who went to another company in a leadership role, and he was like, oh, I'm trying to hire a TPM to do this and a PM to do that. And I was like, oh, I know 3 people. And people who've worked with me are now working together across companies. And so I don't know what to call that metric, but like that network effect or that reach is something I'm looking for now, because it actually goes beyond my current role. So that's how I think about it. And who knows what the next North Star might be.
Perfect. Amazing. I've not had too many bosses to call that they were my best yet, but I'm looking forward to add those over time. Last individual question coming up for Rebecca. How do you recommend TPM candidates position themselves to increase the likelihood of a successful jump to a chief of staff focused role?
I think, I mentioned some general traits earlier. I think to add to that, I would say that trustworthiness is really important, and demonstrating good judgment. Kind of seems obvious, I think, but worth saying. As a chief of staff, you handle a lot of sensitive information. And so you need to be able to show good judgment with that. I think, some of it's just luck and the circumstance. Like part of the reason I got this position is because I'd been at the company long enough to know kind of how things get done here. And so I think staying put at an organization for a longer, and like, it's silly to say for a long time, but like 5 years is a long time. I guess these days, maybe, I don't know how people feel about that, but long enough, I guess. So staying put, I think staying at the organization, so that you have a track record and you have relationships. I think some of it was also experience. I was at a time, both in my experience in software, my experience at the company, and just sort of like my career, trajectory, that it made sense. For me, I felt like confident enough that I could maybe be successful in this job, that I like threw my hat in the ring. I think a year before, I probably wouldn't have, honestly, I probably wouldn't have felt ready. And so some of this is, sticking around long enough to get the experience you need that you can be successful in that role. And I think some of it is like flexibility. I had worked on a lot of different teams and projects at Slack in the kind of 4.5 years before I made this move to chief of staff. And through that process, I got to know a lot of different senior leaders at the organization. And so I think that there was a question in the chat about like, specializing and being a generalist. I took the generalist approach and I moved around a lot. Like I would become kind of like what I would call like a fast expert in like the domain where I was operating. And I would do research and study and come up to speed, as quickly as I could on the topic or the area where I was working. But I did move around a lot. And through that experience, kind of established myself, I think, as well as a generalist who can handle a wide variety of different kinds of problems. So those are my initial impressions on it. I'm happy to ask or answer any follow-up questions. The last thing I would say is you have to be hardworking and you have to be able to get things done. You will have a bad time in the chief of staff role if you can't get stuff done, because a lot of things fall to you, and part of the job is figuring out how to achieve those things, on your own often. And sometimes in the context of it being private or secret, where you have to accomplish something entirely by yourself.
Great. That was great. That was our last individual question, but we have one more question after this for all our panelists. So far, I've loved listening to each of your career paths and the insights you have shared with us. I'm sure there are plenty of folks that would benefit hearing this firsthand today from each one of you. But I believe none of these has been easy, and you would have learned some great lessons along the way. That probably would have prompted this thought for you. I could have done this differently. So my last question for the panelists, and something that I'll start with you, Rebecca, is what advice would you give to your past self or someone looking to follow your path?
I could say there's a lot of advice I could give. I think if I had to pick one thing that I think would actually be the most helpful is you have to have your own value system when you come to work. And one of the things that I have to remind myself of a lot, and it helps me a lot, is this saying that I learned in a theater class in college, which is to uplift others higher than yourself. And a lot of being a TPM, and I think a lot of being a chief of staff, is supporting other people and other teams and doing the best work of their lives and helping them go faster and helping them see around corners. And so I think that this attitude of bringing to the work of uplifting others higher than yourself has been kind of my my anchor, or whatever, my foundation through my career. So that is the advice that I would give.
Great, Rebecca, that was an amazing piece of advice. Over to you, Clemens, now.
Sure, I would say have mentors. I think that's actually very important. Sometimes it's so easy to not have a mentor, but I think actively seeking and asking your network of who could I just talk to, who has been in a situation like this before. I think that's one part. The other aspect is don't overthink it, in the sense that go with your heart and your gut sometimes, and with the people. I know it sounds sort of cliche or buzzwordy, but ultimately over the past 15-ish years in the TPM space, the people have stuck with me almost the most. Sure, there's projects I remember and there's specific highs and lows at the different companies, but focusing on the people and who are folks that you want to work with who potentially might act as mentors in a later state, I think that's super important. It's the human connections that, especially from a TPM perspective, again, are also so critical in our day-to-day lives, that use them not in a manipulative way to your advantage, but just foster these connections. That's one of my things that I really appreciate.
Great, Clemens. Over to you, Yomi.
I would kind of, as Rebecca said, ultimately the judge of all these things, projects, programs, operational cadence, agile operational cadence for a team is results. Yeah? Ultimately, that's what you get judged by. And as a TPM, that's the glue. Three key things I think for me are, I would tell myself kind of back in the ways, improve my learning, how I should have influenced better without authority. Because I came from managing a team to being a TPM, kind of it took a while to make that transition, and knowing that I no longer was in charge, but somehow I still had to help drive results. And so learning to influence without authority would be one. And great communication. Like I needed to improve my comms because again, making sure that people are aware of what's going on, information's shared, and you bring the right information to the right meetings, I think is key. So great comms. And ultimately you're working with people. So maintain great positive relationships because you're gonna need all these folks to get stuff done. And that's how you get to influence them. So I'd say I tell myself that.
Great, great. Last but not the least, advice from Ibrahim.
Yeah, I think there's what advice would you give the past version of yourself versus others? So I'll give you two pieces of advice. The past version of myself, I used to have this joke when I worked with my TPM crew at Twitter, which is, you know, a TPM organization has jumped the shark when you have that argument about red, yellow, green. And everybody's smiling because they've had this debate about, you know, what's really the difference between red and yellow, and are we green this week, or what's the path to green? And when you start having that debate, you're arguing like minutia. And the reason I laugh is when I was in the role, I thought that was the point of the role. Like I would get so hung up on that debate. I remember having debates with eng managers of like, you're red this week. And they're like, no, I'm yellow. Don't put me red. And when I look back and, you know, over the last 1 year with COVID and quarantine, I've had a chance to catch up with a lot of people because there's so much time and you're just like locked inside. And I talked to them and I'm like, oh, I wonder if they remember these debates about red, yellow, green. And nobody remembers any of it. Like they just remember that we solved some good problems, that we trusted each other, and that we moved the ball forward an inch at a time. And so I guess my advice to folks is don't get caught up in the small stuff. It really doesn't matter in the long run. And then the other piece of advice I would give is it is really serendipitous how relationships come back. So I don't think any job I've had since I've come out of college has been the result of me applying for a job. I've applied for many jobs, but every role has been so-and-so knew so-and-so, and there you go. And so I would make sure to treat people right and always be forthright and authentic, and you would be surprised how it'll come back one day. So yeah, that's my advice.
Phew, that wasn't that amazing to hear all of you about your thoughts, so much of thoughtfulness in your answers, so many amazing learnings that you guys shared today. I hope each one of you picked up a few things that you would take from here and build upon for your own careers. I see a lot of Q&A questions have been answered on the channel, and we are anyways past 5 o'clock. So I think what we'll do here is we can use the Meetup event channel for further conversations on any of the questions post the event over the next few days. We can start some threads over there for any conversation on this topic that can help all of us connect further. At this point, I would like to thank our panelists for making this conversation a big success. Let's take a 5-minute break, grab your drink if you would like, join us back in 5 minutes using the next link for the breakout rooms. See the chat window for the link, invitation email for your second link, and the Meetup event channel. Before you go, let me provide just additional context on the next session. We have 4 breakout rooms with 1 panelist each. Spencer, Jen Russell, Amruta, and I would be moderating each room respectively. We expect it to be more conversational and would love to hear from each of you as attendees more than the panelists in that breakout room. The topic over there is what career path you are on and what's next for you. So please participate well. You will be randomly added to the breakout room by Janet. So let's see where we all end up, who we all end up meeting, and learn from each other. Remember to check your email for the Slack workspace link and join it if you haven't so far. Another reminder is for 3 to 4 volunteers who want to organize this event in the next quarter, reach out to me and I can piece the dots with you. Signing off from the webinar, and see you all on the other side in the breakout room. Cool. Bye-bye.